When the young Venkataraman arrived in Tiruvannamalai on 1st September 1896, he did 3 acts of renunciation. He threw away the small change he had, which he'd needed for his trip to come here. He disposed of his Brahmin thread, and he had a shave when somebody asked him if he wanted one. So by those 3 acts, he had more or less formally renounced the world. After that, he came to the temple, and by a miracle, the doors spontaneously opened in front of him. It was closed at the time he arrived, but one by one, all of the doors through all the courtyards opened, and as he presented himself in front of the lingam in the inner shrine, no one was there. He felt a spontaneous urge to go over the bar, which is the last place the public are allowed to go, and he hugged the lingam. In that moment, he said, a burning sensation which had been in his body since the moment of his liberation in Madurai subsided. It was as if the energy was grounded in some way. There was one final thing he had to do after his physical liberation, and that was to make the pilgrimage to the place of his guru and physically unite with the lingam, which represents the mountain of Arunachala. Having completed that piece of business in the inner shrine, I don't think he ever went inside the temple, inside the inner shrine of the temple again. He came outside and he just sat down in a courtyard and was soon lost in a deep, deep state of samadhi. So this is a 16-year-old boy who has run away from home. He has no job, no possibility of earning money, no means of supporting himself. He has simply made a pilgrimage to present himself physically at the place of his guru and his God, and having announced himself by walking into the inner shrine and by hugging the lingam, somehow his physical duties are over and he can relax in the courtyard and see what destiny has in store for him. He sat there for a whole day, being ignored. On the second day, he was noticed by a silent sadhu who looked at him and realized he looked a bit tired and hungry. And the silent sadhu made a gesture to someone saying, feed this boy. He couldn't speak, Bhagavan wasn't speaking. So Bhagavan was offered his first meal at Arunachala. It was a plate of old rice. He said it was floating in some very stale, clear liquid. It was boiled rice. It wasn't prepared in any special way, and there was just a small piece of pickle on the top. It was the most primitive, the most unappetizing meal that you could imagine. But Bhagavan said, I ate it with great relish. This was my first meal. I took it as prasad from Arunachala himself. And he said, even today, thinking of that meal, this is a story he recounted in the 40s, I cannot tell you the happiness I felt when I ate that sour food in the temple. I felt that Arunachala had accepted me, Arunachala had given me my first meal, and that all was well with the world. From that moment on, he continued to be in a state of self-absorption. Occasionally people would come and feed him, and very, very occasionally he would go out and beg. There was one occasion when a lady from town came into the temple and tried to round up all the sadhus and feed them inside the temple precincts. Bhagavan didn't want to be dragooned into this session, so he indicated that he was going to beg for his food and that she needn't take the trouble of feeding him. The woman must have been a little bit suspicious, because she appointed someone to follow him as Bhagavan walked out to go for his first begged meal. Bhagavan said, I felt very shy. I'd never begged for food before in my life, but since this woman had sent someone to spy on me, I had to do it. So he stopped in front of a house in town. He clapped his hands. Somebody came out, and the woman there said, oh, you remind me of my son. I've lost my son. Here, have some food. Come to my house anytime you like. So that was the first time that Bhagavan ever went out and begged for his food. The first time he ate here was about 24 hours after he came. And soon after that, he installed himself in the 1,000-pillared Mantapam, which is the larger building of which the Patala Lingam is just a corner. Now, in those days, there was a very eccentric saint in Tiruvannamalai called Seshadri Swami. People would make fun of him. He had very crazy habits, and the local boys would throw stones at him, make fun of him. And when they saw Ramana coming along, they thought, well, they called him Chinna Shishadri for a while. They thought, here's someone else we can ridicule, here's someone else we can throw our stones at. So because Shishadri Swami found Bhagavan and to some extent tried to protect him, the two were lumped together and they both became targets of the boys' practical jokes. So there was a raised a raised platform in the mantapam just the other side of this wall. Shishadri occasionally would sit there, and Bhagavan also would sit there, but then he found that the local boys would sneak up behind him and throw rocks at him. So he realized he needed a safer sanctuary where he could be hidden from sight and where the boys might be too intimidated to get too close. So he elected to go down the stairs of the Patalalinga here, which is the Samadhi shrine of a long since dead and forgotten saint. Nobody really knows who Saint Patala was, but his body is entombed in here and there's a lingam on top. In Bhagavan's day, this whole mantapam was completely neglected. This particular corner had fallen down, and he said the only occupants were the temple elephant and himself. He went down the stairs and he found this dark, unkept dungeon. The shrine wasn't being maintained. It was damp, it was moist, but for his purposes it was ideal. He could sit in a corner completely out of sight. So he sat there and went into a deep state of samadhi that was so deep, I think it probably lasted several days or maybe even longer. While he was sitting there, insects started to eat his body. He was so oblivious to his body sensations, his body's needs, that he didn't even wake up when the insects started attacking him. And over a period of time, the wounds, because they were in contact with the dirty floor, they became infected, they became open sores, pus formed in the wounds, and still Bhagavan was so completely immersed in the bliss of the self, he wasn't aware that his body was rotting underneath him. A woman called Ratnamal tried to feed him. She came down the stairs with some food, but nothing she said made Bhagavan acknowledge her presence. He didn't accept her food. And then she at least thought, well, if I give him a nice clean cloth, he can sit on this clean cloth, and then possibly the dirt and the insects will find it harder to get into his open wounds. So she left the cloth there. She spoke to Bhagavan and said, this food is for you, this cloth I want you to put under your body. Bhagavan completely ignored her, and when she came back later, the food was uneaten, the cloth hadn't been touched. So this is how it went on. Shishadri Swami tried to look after him, but he was more of a handicap than a help, because wherever Shishadri Swami went, there'd always be a swarm of young boys following him and throwing odd things at him just for fun. So Bhagavan has reported that when he was sitting in the Patalalinga, the boys were too scared to come down the steps to physically intimidate him, but they would throw broken pots down the stairs. He said you would hear these pots crashing, but he said they never ventured down because it was too dark and scary for them. After about 6 weeks, a man called Venkatachala Mudalia came, and he heard some noises down in the Patalalinga and was surprised to see Shishadri Swami walking up the stairs. So he said, what's going on down there? And Shishadri Swami said, there's a young boy down there, he's deeply immersed in the self, but he's in a terrible physical condition. We must do something, we must take him out. So Venkatachala Mudalia went to another part of the temple where he had a friend called Palaniswami, not the Palaniswami who later looked after Bhagavan. And he, with Palaniswami and one or two other people, went down the steps of the Patalalinga, physically picked Bhagavan up, carried him out, and put him in the Gopala Subramanya temple, which is about 50 yards that way. And all the while this was happening, Bhagavan was not even aware that he was being physically removed from the Patalalinga shrine and relocated into a different part of the temple. There are other stories that Bhagavan has told about being in this part of the temple, and he would say, I had no idea whether it was day or night. Sometimes I would open my eyes and it would be daytime, and sometimes it would be dark and I would know it would be night. But he said, I had no idea how many days or nights had passed since the last time I opened my eyes. And he said the one reliable way of finding out how long I'd been in samadhi was to try and stand up and see what happened. And he said if I tried to stand up and my legs buckled, I would know that I'd been out for a long time, and if I could walk, he said I would guess I'd only been out for a few hours or maybe a day or two. And he said also there's a mantapam next door which stores the chariots and the gods for the big parades in town. It's called the Vahana Mantapam. He spent some time in there, and he said sometimes he would sit in one corner, and then when he opened his eyes he would be in a completely different portion of that mantapam with no idea of how his body had moved from the first location to the second. He said there's no way that you could casually sleepwalk from one place to the other. You'd have to crawl over and under and round some very tightly wedged vehicles to get to the new location. He said he never had any recollection of moving in that place, but quite often he would open his eyes and find he was in a different place to the one where he started. Bhagavan, I think he was aware a lot of the time of what was going on around him, but he was in such a deeply absorbed state that he wasn't capable of communicating with people to say whether he wanted food or didn't want food. So I think his hearing was there. He just had a kind of physical paralysis as he was completely subsumed by the self that made him incapable of responding to people who asked him whether he wanted food or care and attention. And he said while he was sitting under the illapai tree, he said he could hear people discussing his case, and one of them said, oh, he's completely mad, he's a madman, he's lost it. And Bhagavan said, I remember thinking to myself, I wish this form of madness would come to everybody. This is the most blissful, the most happiest form of madness there is. I wish everybody in the world could have this state. Now, as he was sitting under the illapai tree, he attracted two devotees who later became his attendants for a short time. One was called Tambiram, and the other was called Udandi Nayanar. Tambiram was a Tevaram singer. The Tevarams are the poems composed by the first generation of Saiva saints, Jnana Sambandha Sundramurti Appar. So he used to sing these songs publicly in order to raise funds, and with the funds he raised he used to support various good causes, and one of his good causes was the young sadhu Ramana sitting in the temple. Also Udandi Nayanar became attracted to Bhagavan at this time, and he also started to serve him. After Bhagavan had been in the temple for a total of about 18 months, Tambiram said that he had a temple on the outside of town where he was performing puja to his guru. And he said that is a more protected environment. People won't bother you there, it's a mile out of town. If you come there, I will continue to support you. I will supply food to you. You stay in the shrine, and myself and Udandi Nayanar will look after you while you're there. So eventually, I think after about 18 months of staying in probably 10 or 15 different places inside the temple precincts, Ramana got up and allowed himself to be taken to Guru Mertam, where the next phase of his life started. We have come down the steps of the Patala Lingam, and we are now looking at the two chambers, one containing a Nandi, the first, and the second containing the Lingam at the back. Bhagavan spent 6 weeks in 1896 in the furthest most chamber, completely oblivious to both his body and the world around him, until he was finally carried out and moved to a nearby shrine by Shishadri Swami and two sympathizers in the ashram temple.